Now that we know the basics of CSS syntax, let's move on and look into the types of selectors into greater details. There are different types of selectors in CSS. We have already used the basic type, which is the HTML element name selector. We have simply provided the name of the tags that we want to modify using CSS, and then provided the sets of declarations within the CSS. However, we can also use class selectors, ID selectors, and contextual selectors. There are other selectors that we will not be covering in this class. For example, pseudo class selectors and attribute selectors, but we may come back to this further down our course. What we're focusing in this particular part of the presentation are class selectors, ID selectors, and contextual or compound selectors. Now, HTML element selector is the simplest one. So we have already tried applying the color red to all the paragraphs. This is very useful because it allows us to apply a number of styles to the selected HTML document. They are least specific of the selectors, but they are very, very useful. However, it's often necessary to apply the styles to a set of elements rather than all the elements with the same HTML element name. So class selector allows you to highlight and select and group in a way specific elements, which will then need to have different types of styles applied to them. So class selectors are more specific compared to element selectors because element selectors apply to all the elements with the same name, while class selectors apply to elements which have got the class name specified within the HTML itself. So in other words, class selectors are providing us with an opportunity to group special tags which will require special treatment within CSS. So how do we actually use class selectors? In order to use class selectors, you'll have to provide the declarations within the CSS, but within HTML, you'll have to specify which tag belongs to a particular class. So let's have a look at an example here. Let's assume that we have a class that we called red paragraph, and we would like to apply this class red paragraph to a particular paragraph that we have displayed on the slide. It's a simple paragraph. It contains a little piece of text. As you can see, it says this text is red and in italics, but it also has got this attribute class added to the p tag itself. So in order to specify that this class is special, we add this class attribute and provide the name of the class here. This class can be applied to more than one tag within your HTML document and can be applied to different elements within your HTML. For example, the same class can be applied to a paragraph, but it can also be applied to a heading. Now, the name may not be intuitive, and red paragraph may not be a good name for a class that is applied to a heading, but theoretically, it's possible. So once you have applied the class attribute to your HTML page, you are ready to move in to the CSS and then specify how this class will need to be displayed. Instead of using p, now we're using dot and then the name of a class. The rest of the CSS syntax is exactly the same. We still have the same declaration block, the same declaration style, and so on and so forth. So once you have created the attribute within your HTML, and once you have applied it within your CSS, the output will be apparent. So if we have a look at an example of the class selector in full, you could, in this case, we're using an embedded CSS, as you can see, because we are using style tag within the head section, and then providing the CSS information within the style tag. We can see that we have H1 and P being in color green, and a class selector which is in red. Now, H1 as well as P are supposed to be presented in green. But we have another P paragraph which has got a special class, which says class node. So this paragraph will then have to be rendered in red. All the other paragraphs will be in green. So why is this happening? We'll talk about this later on, but you have to remember that when you're using classes, the class selectors in this case are more specific and they will take precedence in this case. So all of them will be green except the node, which will be defined and overwritten by the class selector. So this is what we'll see on the screen once the style sheet is applied. Now let's have a look at and see how this actually works in practice. So I'll go back into my demo section. So I have a demo for part 4. I have a few elements here. I'm reusing the HTML from the previous example. So let's assume that we would like to apply now some use some class selectors. So let's say that one of the paragraphs will need to be special. So I'll assign class and give it a name, for example, node, because all nodes will have to be displayed in a different style. I'll just specify it here. So dot node, this is my select class selector, and I'll have to make sure that the color of a node will need to be red, semicolon in the end. And the rest of the parameters, for example, so the rest of the elements, for example, H1 and P, will need to be in green, semicolon in the end. It's not necessary, but it's good practice. So here we go. All of the elements are in green, except for class node. Now, if I take this out, you can see that everything turns green. But once you specified that your special class node, will need to be in a different color, then this becomes green. Now, can you apply the same class to other elements? Yes, you can. So if I go back into my HTML and say that H1 belongs to the same class node, then everything will be displayed in green except those special elements which are highlighted, marked with class node. Good. So this is a good example which shows us that once you have the class selectors, you can group several elements together under a specific name. In this case, this name is node. And then once you have this group of elements, then you can apply them a specific style. And in this case, we applied color red to the elements here. Let me save this and move back into the presentation and continue looking into available selectors. Now, classes are very useful, but they are not the only selectors that we could use within CSS and HTML. We can also use ID selectors. ID selectors allow us to specify a single unique element within an HTML and to control the appearance of this single unique HTML element. So let's have a look at this example where we're using an ID selector. IDs, similar to classes, will have to be specified within the HTML, and to do this we're using ID attribute. ID attribute can be applied to any HTML element, so that's absolutely fine to put this in. So we can have P ID equals red paragraph, That's our special ID. We'll have to use the ID selector now. Now, ID selectors are slightly different from class selectors in terms of how they are presented. When it comes to class selectors, we'll have to use the hashtag and then the name of the ID, unlike classes where we're using dot and then followed by the name of the ID. But in reality, as you can see, the outcomes are fairly similar. So if we have ID red paragraph and then we use hashtag red paragraph to specify that the color for this ID will need to be red and the font style will need to be italic, then we'll get exactly the same output as the one that we have for the use of classes. So I can do exactly the same and achieve exactly the same result by using, and rather than using a class called node, I'm going to use an ID. So this will be ID node. Now, can I change the paragraph ID to node as well? No, because IDs are supposed to be unique. This means that there can only be one ID with a specific node. So maybe this could be node 2, while this could be a node 1, for example. This is allowed. Having the same ID is not allowed. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to remove this. So we'll have just a single ID, which will be node, right? Going back to the CSS, I'll have to control and select this special element, and I can select it by specifying what the ID is. So it's hashtag node, correct? And then within the declaration block, I'll highlight that the color needs to be red, while the font style will need to be italic, semicolon in the end. So now we have the heading, which appears in color red and in italic. So what have we learned here? Even though it appears that classes and IDs will do something rather similar, in reality they are quite different. Classes will allow you to group elements into a single bunch, and that way you can control the appearance of this bunch of elements, while IDs will actually specify a unique element within your HTML page, and you will only be able to control a unique element within this page. So in other words, classes are saying, take the following bunch of different elements and do X with them, with all of them. IDs will say, take this one occurrence of an element and do something with this. Okay, so it's also possible to combine selectors, and you will very often see this in existing CSS code. When it comes to combining selectors, you are able to more specifically highlight which element of this bunch of elements you would like to control. For example, let's assume that you will have a set of elements, say an element, a P element with a class special and an Li element with a class special, but you would like to control only the paragraph element. So in this case, you can simply put the name of the element P, so you're using the HTML element selector along with the class selector dot special, and then applying the style color blue. What this does is it selects only the paragraph from the group of the elements which are combined under the class special. So let's have a look at another example. In this case, I'm reusing the code from demo 01, where we have h1 under class node and p under class node. So we have two elements which are grouped under class node here, and therefore are controlled using our class selector. So both of these elements are actually displayed in red, and as it is specified in CSS. However, if I would like to provide more specific control and only control the paragraph rather than h1, I could add the name of the element right in front of the class, and this will allow me to change the color of the element P, but not h1. Now this was an example where we used a class selector along with an element selector. So this is how we combined one type of selector with another. The same approach can be used with IDs, where we're using an element selector, P, followed by the hashtag and the name of the ID. However, this is often not as useful because IDs are usually unique, so it doesn't usually make sense to have a name of a tag given that the tag ID is unique. The next types of selectors I would like to talk about are so-called contextual selectors. Contextual selectors are relying on the structure of the HTML tree. Contextual selectors are reducing the number of classes and IDs that we're using within HTML. Now, why is it useful? Often it's impossible to modify your given HTML code, but as you can see, in order to change something in terms of the appearance within HTML, we have to go into the HTML and specify which tags are supposed to have specific class names or specific IDs. Now, if you use contextual selectors, you will not be required to modify the HTML code whatsoever. When it comes to contextual selectors, we are writing contextual selectors from left to right, but then we're reading them from right to left. Remember this as we will come back to this rule as we start working with contextual selectors. So let's have a look at the tree to understand how the contextual selectors work. On the slide, we have the tree structure of an HTML page, so we have an HTML which contains the head contains a title, so the title is actually the child of the head element. Within the HTML, we have two child elements. That's the first one was the head, the second one is the body. But within the body, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. Let's show them on the screen. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So within the UL, we have 3 more descendants, and these are our li elements, 1, 2, and 3. Now, so that's our basic HTML structure. Given that we have this special HTML tree, is it possible to refer to specific elements without highlighting the classes and IDs? So let's have a look at how we could do this. Let's look into contextual selectors and understand how they work. You remember that I mentioned that when it comes to contextual selectors, we're writing them from left to right, we're reading from right to left. So in this case number 1, general descendants, what we're trying to select is the A tag, which is positioned within the P tag. Now, to specify that A tag is positioned within the P tag, we're using space between these two elements. So the main difference between grouping the tags and identifying that these two are actually related as descendants, where we're using space rather than a comma. So do we have an element which is located within a paragraph? Let's have a look at the example, which is right here on the right. We have two A elements. One is here within li. It's not located within any P paragraph. And then we have another one right here, and it is within a strong tag, but then eventually it is a descendant of a P paragraph. So therefore, this rule will apply to the tag which is located within P. So general descendants will select any element as long as it is within this specified order. Parent-child is much more stricter because parent will have to highlight that the relationship between the descendant and the ancestor is direct. So there's no any other child in between. So you can't select the grandparent in this case, right? So if we look at this case where we have P and referring to an A tag directly within a P tag, we can see that none of the A tags will actually be selected here, because in the first case, A tag which is within an li does not apply. It's not within a P tag, and in the other case, the A tag, the direct descendant of the direct parent of the A tag is actually the strong tag rather than the P tag. So using a greater than in this case, which highlights that A will need to be directly within the P, will result in selecting no tag. So nothing will be affected by this specific declaration and by this specific CSS rule. You can also select siblings. Now, there are different notations for siblings, and you can select adjacent sibling. And by adjacent, we're referring to the sibling which is immediately below the specified sibling. And general siblings will include any siblings on the same level. Now, for adjacent siblings, we're using the plus sign. Now, what are we referring to? We're reading from the right to left, we have to remember, so therefore we're looking for a P tag, and this P tag will have to be adjacent to H1. So let's have a look at P tags here. We have one P tag and two P tag. We have two P tags, great. And the one which is adjacent to H1 is this one. So, oops, sorry. So we only have one. Apologies. Let's get back to the presentation. So we only have one tag which will be selected by the adjacent sibling, and that will be our very first paragraph displayed right here. Yep. The general sibling, however, will select both of the paragraphs here, the one that follows H1 and the one immediately after. We also have another paragraph right here within the div, but because it's not a sibling, it's not on the same level as you can see. Div is a sibling of H1, but P is not a sibling of H1, therefore this paragraph will not be selected. So I think it would be useful if we go back into CodePen, copy this code in, and try to demonstrate this in practice to see how this actually works. So I've prepared another CodePen here. This CodePen contains the code that we have been looking at as an example. So we have the section, heading, two paragraphs, etc., etc. Good. So what I would like to do is I'd like to select the A tag, which will be within the P tag. And as you can see, I'm using space to highlight that the A tag will need to be within the P tag, right? And specify a color. Let's say color red. Yeah, let's see what changes as a result of this CSS. And we can see that the paragraph, the A tag, which is within the paragraph here, right, has suddenly changed the color from the regular blue to red, right? The element which is within the li has not changed. Now, if I used li space A and said color, let's use another color. Let's say yellow. You can see that the link becomes yellow here, and this is because I specified that the A must be within li. Now we can practice using direct descendants. I would like to select A, which is directly within P. Now, do I have an element which is directly within P? Let's check and see if anything changes here. So let's apply, let's say, font family and apply Arial to the font family. Nothing happens. Let's apply color and say that it needs to be green. Nothing happens. The reason for this is because A that we have here and A that we have here are not direct descendants of a P tag. However, if I add a single, if I add, an element here, let's say A ref equals just something here. Let's first paragraph and let's close the A tag here. So we can see that we can see that first paragraph, which we identified as a link here, is now in green, simply because A is a direct descendant of P. Okay, so now we've practiced with general descendants and direct descendants. Now, what I would like to do now is focus on the adjacent siblings. So let's go back and let's say that we would like to have change the paragraph, which is our P paragraph, right? Which is located within, located on the same level as H1 and is exactly immediately following H1 in this case. So H1 plus P, and I'll set the color to gold. Let's say color gold, and we can see that the paragraph turns yellow in this case, or color gold. And let's do exactly the same for, let's take this out for a moment and apply H1 tilde, which is this squiggle, P, and then provide the color here. Let's say color, should we use red? Let's use red. And here we go. Both of the paragraphs are now selected. This one as well as this one. Which one remains unselected? The only paragraph that doesn't remain selected in this case is the one which is located within the div tab. Okay, so what have we done so far? So far, we have looked at contextual selectors where we have general descendants, where we are specifying the relationship between this by using a space, where we have direct descendants between the parent and the child using greater than sign. We looked at siblings, and siblings in the case of adjacent siblings and general siblings, where the adjacent siblings the ones which are following immediately after the element that we have specified are highlighted with a plus, and general siblings are selected with a tilde. Now that we looked at a number of different types of selectors, the natural question to ask here is which approach is better? All of the approaches are useful, but it's usually better to start with generic elements. So use your HTML element selectors first. If you can't control the presentation of your documents using generic elements, then move on to classes. But you have to remember that you have to use classes sparingly, simply because adding the classes into your HTML makes your HTML looks clunky and untidy. So if the number of classes is becoming rather big and not entirely easy to manage, then you should move on to using descendants, and especially in particular contextual selectors. IDs must be avoided. IDs are very useful parts of the HTML, and they are used with JavaScript, they are used with forms. It is possible to use them with CSS, but it is discouraged. The developers are discouraged to use IDs for styling CSS.